In the years leading up to Truman Capote's death, he began experiencing some disturbing hallucinations and underwent medical scans. What the doctors discovered was downright chilling. Life in the 1940s was already difficult enough, but it was even worse for anyone who was openly gay, especially if they were in the spotlight. Nevertheless, Truman Capote resolved never to change himself for anyone, and possibly, without even intending to, became an early icon for the gay community. Whether or not it angered the public, he freely expressed his eccentric attitude and style. But it only took one publication to spark his tragic fall from grace. Truman Capote lived most of his life as an outlier and constantly strived to go against the norm, which often separated him from the rest of society. Even in his early years, before his fame and scandal, his living situation likely made him feel not at home initially. Following his birth in New Orleans on September 30th, 1924, it wasn't too long before his parents sent him to live with his mother's family in Monroeville, Alabama. As Truman grew older in Alabama, he began to make friends, including several of the neighborhood kids. One of these friends would end up having even more in common with Truman, as she later became another of America's greatest authors under the name Harper Lee. She may have been younger than Truman Capote, but Harper Lee looked out for him and guarded him from the vicious bullies in the neighborhood. They bonded over their dysfunctional childhoods, and she later used him as inspiration for the character Dill Harris in her classic novel To Kill a Mockingbird. Both Capote and Lee also shared a passion for reading and writing, and their talents sealed their destinies. Truman not only showed a great interest in literature, but also an impressive aptitude for it, taking his learning into his own hands. Before he even began his formal schooling in the first grade, he taught himself how to read and write. When he was only 5, he was often a surprising sight to behold, rarely spotted without a notebook and dictionary in hand. However, in 1932, his life turned upside down all over again. His parents had since split up, and his mother remarried. So, in 1932, Truman left Monroeville and moved to New York with his mother and her new husband, Jose Garcia Capote. But no matter where he was, it was clear that he had discovered his purpose. By the time Truman was 11, he was already trying his hand at writing fiction, and began honing his craft from there, submitting his work to contests or possible awards. In 1936, he received some validation when the Scholastic Art and Writing Awards recognized his talents. Naturally, he took his craft very seriously, but sometimes he had a penchant for trouble. After returning to New York, Truman completed his education at a private school before graduating in 1942. Shortly before this, though, he had started a job at The New Yorker. There, he worked as a copy boy for 2 years, until an incident in which he accidentally insulted the poet Robert Frost resulted in his immediate firing. Luckily, something bigger was on the way. The 1940s hit the US hard, and with them came all the horror and uncertainty of World War II, which forced many Americans to the front lines. In Truman's case, the army conscripted him during the conflict, but he never actually served in it. According to his later explanation, every branch rejected him for the most bizarre reason, for being too neurotic. So he went back to what he knew. Truman had no problem writing a steady stream of short stories during this time, but these works weren't just for his friends and family to enjoy. Throughout the 1940s, he saw many of his stories published in magazines like Harper's Bazaar, Prairie Schooner, and even his previous workplace, The New Yorker. Little did he know, this was but a stepping stone to something far greater. One story in particular changed his life forever. Several of Truman's short stories were met with critical acclaim, but with one called Miriam, he got the attention of those who believed they could profit from a partnership with him. Random House Publishing Company contacted Truman and offered him a contract to write a novel, which he accepted. Truman was more than happy to sign on with Random House for his new novel, especially since they provided him with a $1,500 advance. Not someone to stay in one place, Truman spent most of his time writing on the road and in cities across the country, from Alabama to North Carolina to Massachusetts, where he finished Other Voices, Other Rooms before publishing it in 1948. All that was left to do was see what people thought about it. Drawing from his own feelings and experiences as a gay man, Truman's Other Voices, Other Rooms contained subject matter that was quite controversial at the time. However, this didn't stop the novel from becoming an immediate hit with readers, as it sold over 26,000 copies within the first 9 weeks, all while it remained on the New York Times bestseller list. Not everything was about Truman, though. Although Truman refused to hide his identity as a gay man, not everyone could afford to do so. One of his relationships at this time was with a Smith College professor named Newton Arvin, who sadly lost his job when the school discovered his homosexuality. Nonetheless, Truman wouldn't shy away from it and dedicated Other Voices, Other Rooms to Newton. As for Truman, this wouldn't be his last relationship. Truman Capote often enjoyed being the center of attention at various social functions, with one in 1948 standing out in particular. At this cocktail party, as he entertained everyone, Truman met another author named Jack Dunphy. As they got to know each other, it was clear how Dunphy's quieter personality perfectly contrasted with Truman's extreme extroversion. But what was even more evident? Their undeniable chemistry. Although they had opposing personalities, Truman Capote and Jack Dunphy bonded over other aspects of themselves, especially their writing. They often worked on their literary projects together as they traveled, but eventually this wouldn't be enough. As time went on, they would spend less and less time together. On the other hand, Truman had time to focus on his rising popularity. In the wake of the success and publicity that Other Voices, Other Rooms had earned, Random House was more than happy to keep its relationship with Truman going. Signing him to another contract, they published 1949's A Tree of Night and Other Stories, which featured many of Truman's most famous short stories in a collection. He also got a taste of other creative endeavors. As his work continued into the 1950s, Truman didn't stop his usual form of writing, but he also wanted to stretch his talents further by dabbling in other outlets. Moving to live theater, he began writing several projects for Broadway, such as his 1952 adaptation of his own novella, The Grass Harp. Beyond this, he began working as a screenwriter as well. Little did he know that he would pen one of his most iconic works by the end of the decade. By 1958, Truman had compiled another collection of short stories, pairing them with his newest novella under the title Breakfast at Tiffany's, a short novel and 3 stories. The titular novella follows the life of a writer in New York as he begins a friendship with his socialite neighbor. Unfortunately, there were some hiccups with this publication. The Breakfast at Tiffany's novella may have found success, but the road to get there wasn't an easy one. The plan was for Harper's Bazaar to include the story in their July 1958 issue, but the publishers told Truman to change his language as they didn't like the tart tone. Begrudgingly, Truman accepted this as he still wanted the accompanying pictures and design provided by the magazine. Still, it was all for nothing. Despite his disagreement, Truman rewrote parts of Breakfast at Tiffany's to suit the demands of the magazine publishers. But in a frustrating turn of events, they still weren't satisfied. The publishers still found the content to be too improper and worried that they would lose revenue from their advertisers, namely Tiffany and Company, so they ultimately rejected the story. However, Truman wasn't about to give up on the story just yet. He was more upset about the Harper's Bazaar situation than worried about his novella's future, as he had full faith in his other options. Sure enough, he was able to sell the story to Esquire, but had a stipulation of his own. Truman demanded that the magazine use the original pictures that he liked so much. Once again, fate dealt him another frustrating blow, as the magazine only agreed to a single full-page photo. But not all was lost. Although Esquire's choice to use only one of the previous images disappointed Truman, the change was soon overshadowed by the novella's phenomenal reception. Since its release, the titular story and its characters have become possibly the most memorable of Truman's, especially due to its massively successful film adaptation in 1961. However, the adored film adaptation didn't satisfy Truman for a shocking reason. The film Breakfast at Tiffany's stars Audrey Hepburn in the role of Holly Golightly, but her casting didn't please Truman Capote at all. Instead, he'd hoped for a blonde actress to take on the character, and he had one actress in mind, Marilyn Monroe. Though he tried to get the studio on board with his vision, he was once again foiled by the powers that be. But despite this trail of disappointments, Truman was thriving, and the 1960s would only lift him higher. Aside from his brief work on The Innocents, Truman spent the early 1960s writing his newest non-fiction novel, this time with a story that didn't focus on his experiences. Instead, he drew inspiration from a 1959 news article about the unsolved slaying of a Kansas family. As a dramatized version of the incident, he began writing in cold blood. Of course, he was sure to do his research. Truman wasn't about to write an entire novel only based on the one news article he read, so he resolved to get as much of a first-hand account as he could. With his longtime friend, Harper Lee, he traveled to Holcomb, Kansas, where the horrific slaying had occurred. There, he spoke with nearly everyone in the area, whether involved in the investigation or not. Not everyone was on board with the results, though. Truman had conducted his research by relying on his memory retention, which he claimed had been tested at over 90%, and asserted that In Cold Blood was a non-fiction work. However, this remained unconvincing to some, like Philip K. Tompkins, who traveled to Kansas himself and concluded that Truman had fabricated or embellished certain details. While he wouldn't publish another novel, his days in the public eye were just getting started. Another of Truman's prestigious connections was with the publisher of the Washington Post, Katharine Graham, and he made it his goal to celebrate her properly in 1966. Planning an extravagant party called the Black and White Ball, he made Graham the guest of honor. However, this was likely only done so that he had a reason to have the ball in the first place. But this wasn't just any regular event. Word quickly spread about the Black and White Ball as the public hyped it up to be the event of the century, a prediction which turned out to be kind of true. Naturally, anybody who was anybody was frothing at the mouth for an invite to the exclusive party. But Truman had no problem telling people no. In fact, he relished in deciding who was in and who was out. Understandably, Truman Capote had a close inner circle. While he made many connections in high society, Truman took pride in the smaller group of friends he cultivated, which was made up of rich, middle-aged women such as Babe Paley and Ann Woodward. Referring to these women as his swans, he often traveled around with them and delighted in the gossip they often conveyed to him. However, he capitalized on their personal lives in a chilling way. To his swans, Truman proved to be an eager and observant confidant when listening to their secrets, but he wasn't doing it only for them. Secretly, he retained all of this information to use in a new nonfiction book, Answered Prayers. He was planning to publish it in 1968, however, at his urging, the novel was later delayed. When some of it did come out, the content made jaws drop. Before publishing Answered Prayers as a whole novel, Truman allowed Esquire to include several of the finished chapters in its upcoming issues. One of these chapters was featured in a 1975 issue and followed the protagonist, Jonesy, and his discussions with a socialite named Lady Ina Coolberth. Unfortunately, there was a twist. In a shocking reveal, not only had Truman based Jonesy partially on himself, but every other character in the story also had some roots in reality. Whether using the actual names of his swans or making up pseudonyms, he had his characters gossiping about the real-life secrets and private affairs of his friends, and the consequences were unthinkable. Naturally, as soon as Truman published his unintentional exposé, the masses of his readers immediately ate it up, but others weren't as pleased. Truman's social life imploded as most of his swans cut contact with him, since they both felt resentful of Truman's betrayal and that they couldn't trust him with anything else going forward. But the most horrifying fallout of all had everything to do with the actress and socialite Ann Woodward. One of Truman's characters was a woman named Ann Hopkins, about whom the main characters reveal that she intentionally slew her husband. The problem was that she was awfully similar to real-world socialite Ann Woodward, who had accidentally shot her husband after mistaking him for a burglar. Rumor has it that when Woodward heard of the pending publication, the news spurred her to take her own life. Somehow, the nightmare didn't end there. Despite the inherent harm that came with revealing the secrets of all his friends, Truman Capote was surprisingly gobsmacked by the negative reactions he received. Furthermore, he didn't expect to lose his relationships with all his swans, and he didn't handle it well, throwing himself into drinking and substance misuse. But friendships weren't the only thing he lost. Even before Truman's most recent scandal, he and Jack Dunphy had been drifting apart. Although some of this was due to a lack of time together, another significant factor was how Truman seemed to enjoy causing controversy, which Dunphy grew tired of. Still, there were other fish in the sea. Prior to the controversy surrounding his swans, Truman Capote had already met the man whom he would move on to from Jack Dunphy, and who would also make his life all the worse. John O'Shea was a married man and father who met Truman in 1973 and began to spend more time with him, soon becoming the author's business manager. This relationship quickly turned sour. Especially after his scandal, Truman continued on the road to self-destruction, and John was content to be right along with him. Despite being married, John began a romantic relationship with Truman, but it wasn't a healthy one. Usually, while drinking heavily, the two would get in horrible fights, and O'Shea often became emotionally abusive. Sadly, Truman's suffering didn't end there. Over the rest of the 1970s, Truman and John spent most of their time at each other's throats, with their interactions full of manipulation and bitterness. These extremely public issues took a further toll on Truman's already poor well-being, and he could only find comfort in his repeated substance use. Those around him could do little but watch. However, Truman Capote wasn't ignorant of his self-inflicted damage, even admitting in an interview that his use of illicit substances would lead to his demise if he didn't change anything. Despite spending half of his time wallowing in self-pity, he otherwise did his best to seek help, frequently attending rehab institutes throughout the rest of the 1970s. This led to a significant change. In 1979, Capote decided he needed a makeover and underwent a facelift and hair transplant as well as losing weight. However, despite his self-improvements, his relationship to drinking and substance use hadn't gotten better. He also felt that New York wasn't what it once was and retreated from public life. In the early 80s, he experienced a terrifying incident where a hallucination-based seizure landed him in the hospital for a long stay. While he was there, the hallucinations continued. It was incredibly frightening, and doctors struggled to find a cause. Then, after they performed some much-needed medical scans, they discovered something shocking. Capote's brain mass had significantly diminished. As a result, his periods of lucidity grew more and more infrequent, and sadly, these issues would be the end of him. In poor health, Truman Capote had decided he no longer wanted to be in New York, so he traveled to Los Angeles and stayed at the home of one of his last remaining friends, Joanne Carson. Tragically, it was here on August 25, 1984, that he came to the end of his life, passing from liver disease that was brought on by his unhealthy habits. As if that wasn't enough, even some of his legacy was almost lost forever. One of Truman's earliest novels in the 1940s was seemingly not up to snuff in his own opinion, so he gave up on the manuscript and threw it out with the rest of the trash. Thankfully, this wasn't the end of it. Little did he know that a former house-sitter of his apartment had found the manuscript in the garage and saved it from being lost to time. It resurfaced in 2006 when Random House published the story titled Summer Crossing. Indeed, there can be no denying that Truman's incredible legacy, both regarding his literary works and expressive personality, have remained intact. In a society where most who were gay had to live in fear of people finding out, Truman Capote used his fame and social standing to live his life unapologetically. Although there was a gay rights movement during his life, and while he was open about his identity, he never officially supported the cause. Nonetheless, many consider this powerhouse of American literature as one of the most significant figures representing the struggle for equal rights. If you enjoyed this Factinate video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more incredible stories. Want a say in who we cover next? Join our membership program through the link in the description for exclusive perks. Your support means everything to us. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.